Hello, and welcome to the Liberty Classroom course, A History of Conservatism and Libertarianism. This is Lecture 1. My name is Jason Jewell. I'm a professor of history and humanities at Faulkner University in Montgomery, Alabama. I'm also an associated scholar of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and my work has appeared in a number of conservative and libertarian publications. I've also taught a seminar on conservatism and libertarianism here at Faulkner on multiple occasions, and I'm excited to work our way through this material together. We'll be looking at a number of very interesting thinkers, some challenging ideas as we go through, really starting around the 18th century and coming up to the present day, looking at these two political philosophies of conservatism and libertarianism. This first lecture, we're going to try to nail down some definitions, get a handle on what we're talking about. Some of these terms, the names of these philosophies can be pretty slippery, and you'll hear them used by different people with obviously different definitions, and it's important for us to take a few minutes here at the beginning of this lecture series to figure out exactly what we're talking about when we use these terms. We'll go, for the most part, in a chronological format. Now, if we wanted to, we could go all the way back to antiquity, and we could start talking about Aristotle and his views on private property and that sort of thing. I don't think that would probably be the most productive use of our time. Of course, if you're a subscriber to the Liberty Classroom site, you know that Professor Jared Casey has a two-part lecture series on a history of political thought. And I'll be referring to those two courses from time to time in the lecture. There are certain thinkers that Professor Casey goes into in much more detail than we will in this series of lectures, but he goes all the way back to antiquity as well. So I'd be covering a lot of the same ground that he did in his courses if I were to start with Aristotle, for example. So we're going to begin discussion really in the 17th and 18th centuries in the English context and work our way up to the present. The terms conservatism and liberalism, we'll be looking at classical liberalism in this course as well, don't really come into usage until the 19th century, but they have clear antecedents in the 17th and 18th centuries, and we'll be looking at those in the first few lectures after this one. Then when we get into the 20th century, of course, then we start to see libertarianism being used as a term for a particular political philosophy and political movement. So we'll introduce that at the appropriate point in the course. Thematically, again, my hope for this course is that it will complement rather than repeat a lot of what Professor Casey has done in his two courses on the history of political thought. We will take a look at a number of major political thinkers in conservatism, classical liberalism, and libertarianism. We will probably deal with more thinkers from those time periods than Professor Casey does. He goes into very great detail with a number of these thinkers, and where appropriate, I'll make reference to his lectures and say, if you want to know more about Edmund Burke, for example, go listen to the three lectures on Edmund Burke in Professor Casey's course. But in addition to talking about the political thinkers and the ideas, we'll also be taking a look at certain important institutions that have played a role in the development of conservatism and liberalism and libertarianism. And we'll also go beyond that to examine cultural attitudes and how they shift over time. This is particularly important with conservatism, I would say, because many conservatives describe themselves as being more concerned not with politics per se, but with a general cultural attitude towards phenomena like religion and notions of tradition and that sort of thing. We'll get more into those details where appropriate. So in this lecture, I want to take some time to try to look at some definitions of these three schools of thought: the conservatism, classical liberalism, and libertarianism. It's very important for us to try to get a handle on the meaning of these terms, and so I've taken quotes from several different thinkers here, and we'll try to break those down and see exactly what these people mean when they use these terms, because they don't always mean the same thing, unfortunately. So we run into the danger of equivocating, really, particularly when we are in conversation with someone who may not be approaching these ideas from the same background that we do. We'll start with conservatism, and I would like to introduce the problem of defining conservatism by referring to a debate, a miniature debate that took place on Facebook not too long ago by none other than two of Liberty Classroom's professors, Brian McClanahan and Kevin Gutzman. In the summer of 2014, these two gentlemen had an argument on Facebook over the question, was Thomas Jefferson a conservative? Should 21st century figures such as us look at Jefferson, treat him as a conservative or not? Answering in the affirmative was Professor McClanahan. Answering in the negative was Professor Gutzman. And here are the arguments that each one of them made for their position. Brian McClanahan says, yes, we should consider Thomas Jefferson a conservative. The main reasons that he offered were that, first of all, Jefferson was a Republican, and this is a Republican in the broad sense, not in terms of the Republican Party, but with the idea that Jefferson favored classical republicanism, the idea of self-government. We're not going to be ruled by a king. This is not going to be a sort of top-down society. There will be a measure of self-government reflected in the institutions and so on. So to McClanahan, that's a conservative position. Also, Jefferson was a constitutionalist. He was a firm opponent of arbitrary power. And he wanted to, as the famous quote of his says, to bind down the government with the chains of the Constitution, to have strictly limited governmental powers. Again, McClanahan says this is a conservative position. Jefferson was also a federalist, not in the way that we often use the term federalist in American history to refer to the people who wanted a strong central government, but in the sense that Jefferson favored the federation of states, where the states retained their sovereignty vis-a-vis the federal government, and they were parties to a compact, that they were the ultimate arbiters and decision makers, and if push came to shove, they could pull out of that compact if they wanted to via secession. Also, of course, Jefferson makes the argument for nullification in the resolutions of 1798, the Kentucky resolutions and the Virginia resolutions. So again, McClanahan says this resistance to federal power is a conservative position. And then finally, Jefferson was an agrarian. He thought that the noblest way of life, the healthiest way of life, it was the rural lifestyle, the living on the farm, the traditional agrarian way of life, and was more distrustful of urban life and the kind of people who live in cities. And we get into things like bankers and folks like that. So McClanahan says Jefferson is being conservative here as well by favoring a more traditional rural life than the life of the more modern cities. Well, opposed to all of this is Kevin Gutzman, who says that no, we should not consider Thomas Jefferson to be a conservative, and he offered several points in defense of that position as well. For one thing, Gutzman says Jefferson was opposed to Christianity, and according to Gutzman's understanding of conservatism in the Western tradition, conservatives are defenders and champions of the Christian faith. So when Jefferson comes along and expresses deistic ideas and chops up the New Testament to take out the passages concerning miracles and things like that he finds irrational, Gutzman says this is not what a conservative would do. This sort of religious skepticism is one that disqualifies Jefferson from being considered a conservative. Also, Gutzman says Jefferson was anti-aristocratic, not in the sense that he was opposed to all disparities of wealth, but the actual titles of nobility. Of course, written into the Constitution is the requirement that American citizens not receive titles of nobility from foreign powers. We're not going to have any titles of nobility in America itself. And Gutzman says that conservatism in the Western tradition is in favor, or at least not opposed to having class distinctions and different statuses in law for different classes of individuals. Of course, throughout much of Western history, if you were a noble, then you had a certain privileged status in the law and had certain privileges that other people did not have. Well, Gutzman says if Jefferson is opposed to this, then he can't really be considered a conservative. Also, Gutzman says Jefferson is a big proponent of civil liberties. He's this big champion of freedom of the speech and freedom of the press, and is instrumental in getting a lot of these ideas put into the American system of government. Gutzman says this is not a conservative position either. This is much more of a liberal position, trying to protect the liberties of the individual against what a conservative might think are laws curtailing these liberties in pursuance of the common good. So once again, Gutzman says Jefferson is not a conservative. And then Jefferson also introduces a number of, either calls for or actually implements a number of wide-ranging legal reforms in his state of Virginia. Jefferson favored changing the inheritance laws to allow females the same inheritance rights as males. He wanted a broadly based system of public education in Virginia. There's all sorts of legal changes that Jefferson wants to make that are sort of inspired by Enlightenment thinking, and Gutzman says none of this is conservative or should be considered conservative. So here we have these two Liberty Classroom professors disagreeing on one of the founding fathers and whether he should be considered a conservative or not. Well, you may have picked up on the one of the themes of this debate is that for Brian McClanahan, and McClanahan, by the way, is advancing the position of scholars like Clyde Wilson. Wilson published an influential article in one of the American history journals a number of years ago talking about the Jeffersonian conservative tradition and laying out a lot of the same points that McClanahan does here in this debate. And if constitutionalism and federalism and agrarianism, if all these things are conservative, well, then they're really conservative in an American context. Maybe within an American context, we can consider these things conservative. Gutzman, on the other hand, is looking at the broader tradition of conservatism that goes back to Europe. And certainly in pre-1789 Europe, before the French Revolution, no one who was opposed to Christianity or opposed to an aristocracy, none of those people would be considered conservative in any way. So I think part of the answer to this debate that McClanahan and Gutzman have is recognizing the context in which we're talking about. Maybe what's conservative in an American context is not really conservative in a traditional European context. Maybe what is going on within American history is, from the European point of view, is really different strands of liberalism having a contest with each other. So we'll try to untangle some of that as we move forward in the course. But as you'll see when we get to the lecture on 18th century America, I'm not really going to make much of an effort to distinguish who's the conservative and who's the liberal here, because to a great extent, a lot of what's happening in the 18th century, anyone in the 18th century in America at least, anyone proposing those kinds of things today would be considered a conservative in the 21st century, although at the time they might have been considered more liberal. So again, we'll try to untangle a lot of that as we go along. I just point out this debate to show that there is no absolute consensus on what this word conservative means. Let's take a look at the definition of conservatism that is offered by Bruce Froning, an influential conservative scholar. This comes from the book American Conservatism, an Encyclopedia. This is the definition that Froning gives of conservatism. Conservatism is a philosophy that seeks to maintain and enrich societies characterized by respect for inherited institutions, beliefs, and practices, in which individuals develop good character by cooperating with one another in primary local associations such as families, churches, and social groups aimed at furthering the common good in a manner pleasing to God. Well, obviously that is a lengthy definition. It's quite a mouthful. There's several things that Froning offers us there to chew on, to reflect on. I want to point out a couple of things in this definition that I think are very important. First of all, that Froning says conservatism emphasizes a respect for inherited institutions, beliefs, and practices. All right, so here we have the idea of tradition. The old saw, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is a quintessentially conservative way of looking at the world. There is no need for each succeeding generation to reinvent the wheel. Our ancestors have passed down to us institutions and ideas and laws, beliefs, all of these things that we can view them as being, if not 100% correct, as being largely correct, largely true, because they've stood the test of time. So that is a conservative inclination, that we don't innovate simply for the sake of innovation. We stick with the tried and true, we stick with what has worked in the past, and we only make changes when there are compelling reasons to do so. So this emphasis on tradition is one that Froning brings out here in this definition of conservatism. Another interesting point here, where Froning characterizes conservatism as favoring people interacting with each other in primary local associations. In other words, we don't want to turn the governance of society over to large behemoth institutions such as the U.S. federal government, because you get to that scale and things become very impersonal, very bureaucratic. At a smaller scale, local communities, families, churches, these are the institutions that are on a human scale that can provide us with the genuine human interaction that we need in order to develop our own character. So it's this idea of individuals developing good character. There's a moral dimension to this idea of conservatism. And then finally, it's aimed at furthering the common good. In other words, according to Froning, conservatism is not a philosophy of individualism. It's not self-interest guiding everything. People are striving for the common good, whatever is good for the community, for all people. And then finally, in a manner pleasing to God. So as Froning defines it, inherent in conservatism is a belief in God. There is a religious cast to this philosophy. So a number of things that Froning offers as being integral or essential to conservatism. Here are a couple of other scholars making comments about conservatism. Patrick Allett, professor of history at Emory University, says this: conservatism in politics is an attitude that favors cautious and prudential changes rather than opposing change at all costs. So here again, Allett is emphasizing the conservative value of tradition, where conservatives do not think it's wise or prudent to come in with sweeping changes to existing regimes, to existing legal structures and codes and that sort of thing. Change should be cautious, it should be prudential, it should be incremental. Conservatives are not necessarily opposed to change, but they want to see compelling reasons before they will go along with changes because, again, the old saw, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Here's George Nash, a historian of American conservatism in particular, who says that conservatism defends old modernity against new modernity. Now, again, Nash is speaking of the American context here. So he's talking about American conservatives defending, when he uses this phrase, old modernity, what he's referring to is the sort of the bourgeois values of the rising middle class of the 18th century. So the values of thrift, the work ethic. The Protestant ethic is a big part of Nash's understanding of old modernity in the Anglo-American tradition. And the conservatives are defending this idea. Again, there's a religious cast to this. They're defending this against the new modernity, which Nash describes as a sort of existentialism and pessimism and religious skepticism, all of these things that tend to, well, in Nash's view, the conservative thinks that the new modernity is one that is going to tear society down if those ideas are widely held and promoted. So these are several different ideas about conservatism. Again, as we go through the lectures, we'll point out along the way what different thinkers have contributed to this understanding of what it means to be conservative. Let's look at classical liberalism. And here again, we've got a definition from American Conservatism and Encyclopedia. This article on classical liberalism was contributed by Ralph Raico, who some of you may know as a senior fellow of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, has done many things for the Mises Institute over the years, and his writings have been very widely distributed. Raico writes that classical liberalism is the term used to designate the ideology advocating private property, an unhampered market economy, the rule of law, constitutional guarantees of freedom of religion and of the press, and international peace based on free trade. So again, a lot of positions packaged there into this definition of classical liberalism. So liberals favor private property. Well, many conservatives favor private property as well. But the liberals, according to Raico, this is a real hallmark of their philosophy. An unhampered market economy, whereas many conservatives through the years have been suspicious of the idea of a laissez-faire economy, that the government ought to regulate the economy in pursuit of the common good. The liberals, according to Raico, classical liberals at least, believe that the market economy should operate freely and unhampered, allowing individuals to pursue their own self-interest through market exchanges. The rule of law, again, there's an opposition to arbitrary power there. Constitutional guarantees of freedom of religion and of the press. As you see, a lot of this is sounding very much like Thomas Jefferson's thought, like we were just talking about on the previous slide. And then finally, international peace. All right, so as we'll see, this is a set of ideas that is sort of in its early stages in the Whig movement in England in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then is developed further into a more articulate and coherent political philosophy in the 19th century. What about libertarianism? Here is David Bose, scholar at the Cato Institute, in his book, Libertarianism, a Primer. Now, compare this to what we just read from Ralph Raico. Here's Bose. Libertarianism is the view that each person has the right to live his life in any way he chooses, so long as he respects the equal rights of others. Now, of course, Raico's definition of classical liberalism is much more granular, much more precise, but all of the things in Raico's definition are consistent with what Bose says here about libertarianism. Now, for many people who call themselves libertarians, libertarianism and classical liberalism are basically the same thing. They are synonyms. So if you go, for example, to the website of the Institute for Humane Studies, you'll see there that classical liberalism and libertarianism are, in their eyes, basically the same thing. So you look at a definition like Bose's and you could see, well, maybe libertarianism is now just classical liberalism by another name. But not every self-described libertarian views libertarianism in that way. Here, for example, is Walter Block, another senior fellow of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. See what he has to say about libertarianism. This is from an article that was published in the Journal of Libertarian Studies titled Libertarianism and Libertinism. So Block writes, "Libertarianism is a political philosophy. It is concerned solely with the proper use of force. Its core premise is that it should be illegal to threaten or initiate violence against a person or his property without his permission. Force is justified only in defense or retaliation." So Block here is articulating what libertarians often refer to as the non-aggression principle or the non-aggression axiom. And this is a bit different in emphasis from Bose's definition of libertarianism that we saw on the previous slide. Whereas Bose is talking more about a philosophy of individual freedom and individuals living their lives, and it's sort of like a positive affirmation of the freedom of people to do what they want to do. Block is focusing more on the negative side of libertarianism. In other words, libertarianism is about restricting people from using violence against each other. And this difference in emphasis may sound pretty subtle, but there are points along the way where it does have an impact on different camps within libertarianism and why they wind up disagreeing with each other. So once again, we'll try to untangle some of that as we move through the course. Block is also emphasizing here that libertarianism, according to his definition, has nothing to say about non-political things, such as whereas that definition of conservatism talks about a belief in God, the development of a good character, Block would say that doesn't really have anything to do with libertarianism, strictly speaking. Libertarianism is only about the question of when it's permissible to use violence. So libertarianism doesn't take positions on, as a political philosophy, doesn't make any kind of pronouncement about moral values or religious values or any of that sort of thing. Now, in this course, we're scheduled to go for 30 lectures, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. And for about the first half dozen lectures or so, we're going to be looking at the early development of conservatism and classical liberalism. Lectures 2 through 4 roughly will be looking at the 18th century and earlier, and then the next few lectures after that will be looking at the 19th century. So that's really, those first 5-6 lectures will be sort of laying the foundation for what will be our major emphasis in the lecture series, which will be the 20th and 21st centuries. Once we get up to the 20th century, we'll spend several lectures talking about the so-called old right. These are a collection of writers and thinkers who may not have been all that influential politically at the time that they were writing, but provided inspiration to later generations of conservative and libertarian thinkers. And there's a lot of overlap with the old right. These are people who opposed the New Deal, for example, in the 1930s. So we'll look at some iconic figures there like Albert J. Nock and H.L. Mencken and these kinds of folks. Going along with the idea of the old right, we'll be looking at the philosophies of distributism in England and also Southern agrarianism in the United States. These are movements that have a lot of overlapping ideas about the distribution of property in society and so on. And there are a number of influential writers connected with those movements, such as G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc in England, and then in the United States, the Southern Agrarians, we've got a circle of writers around Vanderbilt University in the 20s and 30s who write some very important essays and books defending this idea of a traditional agrarian society. We'll also be looking at the phenomenon of anti-communism, which becomes very pronounced in the United States following World War II. And of course, there are plenty of anti-communists in the U.S. before World War II as well. But anti-communism comes to be seen by a lot of historians, a lot of people at the time, as a conservative position. And we'll see to what extent people who identified as anti-communist would measure up to the principles of conservatism and classical liberalism that we've been seeing in these definitions earlier in this lecture. Neoconservatism excites a lot of controversy and opinion and commentary these days. And what makes a neoconservative different from a traditional conservative or from a libertarian? We'll be talking about that as well in later lectures. In the 1980s and 1990s, we had developing what was sometimes called the paleo movement, paleo-conservatives, paleo-libertarians. We'll talk about who the major figures in those camps are and what made them different from conservatives and libertarians who were more, I guess we might say, more establishment at that time. And then, as we come up into the 21st century, we'll take some time to look at the Ron Paul presidential campaigns of 2008 and 2012. Of course, Ron Paul also ran for president on the Libertarian Party ticket in the 1980s. But we'll talk about the extent to which Ron Paul is a pivotal figure in the history of libertarianism, and also how many conservatives admire Ron Paul to a great extent as well. And then we'll wrap up the series of lectures with an examination of some of the current issues, some of the hot topics, points of agreement, but also points of debate between conservatives and libertarians. We'll talk about questions like some of the wars that the United States, military actions the United States has been in recent years, issues like intellectual property. We'll be looking at all those near the end of the course. So once again, I'm grateful that you have taken the time to get into this lecture series. I'm really looking forward to sharing a lot of this information with you over the next couple of dozen lectures, and I hope that you'll find it enriching. I'll be posting recommended readings and links to some of the important texts of these various writers and thinkers along the way, and I hope you'll enjoy being along for the ride as well. Thanks for watching.